y'all have been here before, so you know the background of John. And so we're not going to go through that again, review that so much again. But we are in chapter 10. It's kind of unique because we're looking at one of the things that are distinct in John, and those are the I am statements, and there are 7 of them that John uses in his gospel, and 2 of them in chapter 10, which makes them kind of interesting. And those 2, unlike other places, those 2 are very closely related and might kind of be confusing because it's all based on one story, and these 2 images are drawn from that one story where Jesus puts himself in 2 different roles in that story. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Anyway, we're in chapter 10, good. I looked down and I didn't see. I saw a blank sheet and I thought that's not a good sign. If we're in chapter 10, so we're chapter 10, how does chapter 10 begin? What do we see right at the beginning of chapter 10?
He said he's the gate.
Okay, he starts talking about sheepfolds and gates. Now, remember, in chapter 9, what did we deal with in chapter 9? What was chapter 9? The entire chapter was one.
The blind.
Okay, the blind man seeing. And now we've got him talking about sheepfolds. So we don't seem to have a real strong connection between what he just did in chapter 9 and what he starts talking about in chapter 10, because chapter 10 seems more like Jesus, some dialogue, but it's a lot of Jesus talking. In chapter 10, if you got red print in your Bible, there's a lot of red in chapter 10 because it's mainly Jesus talking and people saying what, just responding a little bit, and then Jesus talking more. Now it's interesting as it's sort of shaped. He's going to come back to blind at one place in this account, which is kind of interesting. Which kind of ties it to chapter 9. But there doesn't seem to be a real strong connection between what's happening in chapter 10 and what just happened in chapter 9. Okay, so we've got Jesus starts right at the beginning of chapter 10. He starts telling what? What is he telling right at the beginning? And I'm thinking about between verses 1 and 5. What does he do? What is Jesus doing?
He's telling a story.
He's telling a story, right? And a story that, as we're going to look at it, remember I said that you don't have many parables in John. This is the closest, really about the closest you get to a parable in the Gospel of John. And the way he uses it, the way it's used, it's really not the way Jesus used parables. Remember, he said he gave parables in the other 3 Gospels. You remember the purpose of them?
So that people didn't understand.
That's what he says. That I gave parables, which is a parable is a riddle.
Well, he was right. I didn't understand.
Yeah, so he accomplished his goal. And they were more like, and sometimes very, very short. This is going to be more of what you call an allegory. And an allegory is a story where everything has a lesson or meaning. Every item. This is like. And so it has more like an allegory than a parable, where you kind of look at the whole and get a meaning from the whole. Here you kind of break it into pieces and figure out what those pieces, represent. Okay, so we're going to approach it a little different than how we would approach most parables, unless Jesus explains it, which he does some parables, and they kind of sound like allegories a little bit. Anyway, so we've got this story, and what's the location for the story?
Sheep.
And by the way, I preached this. This is what we talked about on Sunday. Okay, it is a sheep pen, sheepfold, whatever, same thing. And what is a sheepfold?
The sheep.
Or
the
place
sheep
where they keep the sheep.
Okay, it's a place where they keep the sheep, like a corral.
A pen.
Yeah, a pen, a corral, something that's kind of protected. And so we've got, the story takes place as a sheepfold, and we've got some characters introduced. And what are the characters we have introduced in those 5
A
verses?
thief and a robber.
Okay, we've got one set, because we got thieves and robbers, that's one. Who else we got?
Watchman.
We got gatekeeper, watchman.
We got shepherd.
We got shepherd. And then, and this is really...
A stranger.
We got strangers, thank you. Because it's a different word in Greek. When it talks about strangers, I don't think he's talking about thieves and robbers. Because even after that, he'll talk about them. But we've got strangers. So we really got 4 outside of the most obvious characters, which are not human. We've got sheep. We got a lot of sheep. Okay, and the sheep sort of react, to what's going on. Now, when we've got thieves and robbers, we've got gatekeeper, we got shepherd, and we've got images, and we got strangers. And what's the first 2 that are, and then sheep kind of wandering around. What are the first 2 that are contrasted right at the beginning? As he tells the story, we got a contrast, right?
Person that didn't come in by the gate.
Okay, and they are, well, who?
Thieves.
Okay, thieves and robbers. We got thieves and robbers here, and we've got contrasted with
The gatekeeper and
shepherd. And we got gatekeeper and we got shepherd, right? Because we got thieves and robbers and shepherds, and they're contrasted in what way? In what way are they contrasted?
How they carry the sheep.
Well, how they
Enter.
entered initially. You're right. That's going to be a little later, their motivation. But we don't get that at first, except from the name. You assume thieves and robbers have, some malice in mind. But it's how they get into the sheep pen, right? Because you've got the thieves and robbers that do what to get in?
Crawl over the fence.
Okay, climb over the fence.
Enter through the gate.
And the shepherd enters through the gate, which means
He's allowed
in by
the watchman.
the watchman, the gatekeeper, the one who's keeping the gate, opens the gate for the shepherd. So we got this contrast, the first contrast between the shepherd, and I'm going to put the shepherd first because then we got another contrast. The shepherd and the thieves and the robbers, how they get into the sheep pen. One climbs the fence, the other one comes through the gate, which would have been opened by the gatekeeper or the watchman. Now we've got then another contrast after that, right? And what's the other contrast? Well, hold on hired hand, because we're not there. We're just in the first 5 verses.
Okay.
The stranger, right? We've got a contrast between the shepherd and the stranger, and that is kind of interesting, because if the first contrast is how both of them got in, and that's the principal contrast, what's the contrast between the shepherd and the stranger that's already in the pen?
The sheep don't respond to the strangers.
The voices, the sheep don't respond to the stranger. They respond to the shepherd. And what does the shepherd do because the sheep respond to his voice?
He calls them by name.
Does he let them in?
No, he takes the sheep out.
He takes them out. So it's really interesting that in one, it involves how you get in, right? Mm-hmm. And in the second contrast,
How they get out.
is how you get out. And the shepherd comes through the gate, unlike these other guys, and the shepherd leads them out
By his voice.
through the gate.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah,
Right? Where they recognize it, but he leads them out through the gate,
Yeah.
and the stranger doesn't. And they run away from him. So he can't lead them anywhere because the sheep don't respond. Okay, so we've got this kind of cool contrast in just this little story. And this is a story that's going to be the basis for the rest of the chapter, because it's going to be, Jesus is going to develop it in different directions. Fill it in a little bit. And we know the story is over. This little story is done in 5 verses, because what does John write in verse 6?
He used this figure of speech, but they didn't understand what he was saying.
Yeah, so he's done, with this story. He uses this, and the people who are hearing don't understand. Well, why don't they understand?
Well, it wasn't very clear.
Well, but we, the reader, know a little bit. Well, why don't they understand? Because when we read this, we kind of understand it.
Because we have background stories.
We have, what else do we
The
have?
Holy Spirit.
We know who the gate is.
They know who the gate, they believe, right? And their belief, these guys, they don't believe. So they don't understand. And in fact, when we look at the rest of the story, as Jesus kind of develops it and applies it in different ways, the people are going to consistently say, I don't buy that. In fact, by the end, they're going to want to arrest him because of it. It's going to lead in directions that are going to cause them to say, we got to get rid of this guy again. Okay, so we got this story as the basis. Everything else is going to be built around. And now in verse 7, Jesus starts applying, right? We got the story, he's going to start applying it. And what does he say in verse 7?
He's the gate.
Okay, he says, I am
The gate.
the gate. Now, how does this represent... now, we usually, when we think of Jesus, when we look at the story initially, in what role do we put Jesus immediately? Shepherd. Okay, and he's going to say that a little later about being shepherd. But we put that, as we read those 5 verses, we say, oh, well, Jesus is a shepherd. Oh, Jesus is a shepherd. Now, but Jesus doesn't initially say that. He says, I'm the gate. Now, how might seeing Jesus as the gate, and I kind of think this is significant. If we see Jesus as a gate, how does it shape our understanding of shepherds? If Jesus is the gate, he says shepherds come in, the shepherd comes in through the gate, I am the gate. How does that shape our understanding of
Then
shepherds?
we have to go through Jesus.
Well, I guess, yes, absolutely. How do we understand if Jesus isn't saying, he doesn't say, I'm the gate and the shepherd. He didn't say, I'm the shepherd of her. He says, I'm the gate. But he's already talked about shepherds coming in through the gate, right? How does that, if that's the case, how might Jesus want us to see shepherds initially? And I'll tell you, I think this is the case by the way he describes himself as shepherd. And we'll get to that in just a little bit.
As followers of Jesus.
Okay. So shepherds become
Leaders.
leaders. Okay. So it's if we take that step back and say, initially when Jesus wants us to look at this story, he didn't want us initially to see himself in that shepherd role. That'll come later. And he'll do it with a qualification that's fairly significant. Instead, he wants us to focus our attention on the gate, how to get in. The gate is the way to get in. And shepherds that are in the sheep pen, sheepfold, they're the ones that came in
Through the gate.
through the gate.
Yes.
The gate. So now you got leaders maybe that are, and you could even put it as a plural, that it's not just the shepherd, but shepherds. Okay, shepherds. Okay, and thieves and robbers then become those who
Don't come in through the gate.
don't come in through some other way. So what then becomes the purpose? Initially, what becomes the purpose of the gate?
That we are his sheep.
Well, what becomes the purpose of the gate?
Well, you have to go through him.
Okay, you go through him.
He's the way,
Yeah.
the truth, and the life.
Which he's going to say
Which
in the next
allows
chapter.
us to be able, we have to go through the gate to get to God.
Right. Okay, so that's where his focus is right now. And that there are shepherds here in the sheepfold that came in through the gate. There are other people in the sheepfold that jump the fence.
False prophets.
Oh, good. That are false. And they're false because they came in another way. Now, he hasn't explained it. If I say you got to come in through Jesus, and what a person, if I say you gotta come through Jesus, you gotta come in through Jesus. What's the next question? What's the first question the person should ask? How do you do it? What does that mean? I don't want the person to say, okay, I believe that. Because if you don't know what it means, you don't know what you're doing. You're just using words. Well, I did it. I came in through Jesus. Well, what does that mean? What the heck does that mean? Well, he's already talked a lot about believing and trusting that he is who he says he is. So we can kind of move in that direction. Okay, so it becomes really interesting that we've got this kind of contrast. Now, who is mentioned in verse 10? Because now we're talking.
The thieves and robbers.
Okay, now we've got thieves and robbers, and what does he say about thieves and robbers?
That they didn't listen to him.
Okay, they didn't
kill and
listen,
destroy.
and they came to kill and to destroy. So we've got one that we didn't have before, as he kind of...
Motive.
We got motive. So now we know why the shepherds who come through Jesus, what does the shepherds, these folks, what do they... let me pull back on that. We know the thieves and the robbers who jump the fence are looking to destroy. How do we know for absolutely certain that they couldn't have come through the gate?
Because the sheep don't listen.
Well, the sheep
one.
don't listen, for one. What else?
And they didn't come through the gate through Jesus.
What does... They want to kill. What did Jesus came to do?
He came
Save.
to save and to lift up, protect.
Protect. In fact, he says, what does he say? When you look at like in verse 10.
Whoever enters through me will be saved.
And find you green pastures.
Okay. He's coming on the screen. I came, verse 10. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that they may have...
Life.
That
Boom.
to the fullest.
They came to kill you.
And
I
to
came
save.
to give you life. You know, so the contrast is here. So if they went through the gate, they'd be doing what?
Good
They'd
things.
be giving you life.
They'd be giving you life. They'd be looking to give you life. Since they didn't come through the gate, that's one way you can tell. Because they're looking to kill you. You know, they're not looking to give you life at all. Okay? All right. So if we're looking at this as an allegory, what is he talking about here in that first image? You know, the gate. Who's he really talking about?
Himself. God.
Well, he's talking about God when he says, I am the gate.
I am.
Yeah.
The I am.
You know, the I am the gate. He's talking about how these leaders that are there, you got to evaluate how the leaders are leading, because that's going to tell you how they entered. You know, how they entered the gate. Now, again, with the strangers, it's different too, because the strangers, they don't listen. The sheep don't know what the strangers are saying. So they're not going to follow them out. Now, so we've got what he says about the gate. So the gate is really a judgment, a lesson about these people who are in the sheepfold, right? Trying to manipulate the sheep. And you can tell because the ones that are false are not bringing life. They're bringing death. They didn't come through the gate, because if they did, they'd be bringing life. And how do we get life? Who brings life? What is because if Jesus isn't here, Jesus isn't physically here at the table, what would a person do who was bringing life?
Have faith.
Well, what would he be doing? What would a leader be doing for y'all if he's
pointing it to God.
pointing to what Jesus said, the Jesus who was revealed, who reveals God, the light that reveals God. You know, the bread that gives life, the light that enlightens the world. You know, that's what a person that comes through the gate does, and the person who doesn't isn't doing that. So we've got this little first application of the allegory has to do with people there. Therefore, if we project this past this context to a church that's reading this, 60 years later, how do you think a church would 60 years or 2,000 years later would interpret this?
If you're not pointing them towards Jesus, then you're a false prophet.
Yeah, and pointing them more towards the Jesus revealed here. We got to be really careful, because a person can say, I'm going to point you got to believe in Jesus. Well, tell me about the Jesus. Tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus? Well, Jesus is the one that came with these new laws that you got to follow. Red flag, flapping in the breeze. That's not, well, Jesus, I'm telling you about the one that's going to send you to hell if you don't do certain things. ooh, I didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved in me. All of a sudden we got these red flags flapping in the breeze. That person, is he coming to represent Jesus? Is he coming bringing life? He certainly uses the right language.
But he's praising that.
But it's not, or she is not reflecting, you don't have to do that at all. You don't have to believe much of anything. You'll feel fine. Don't worry. Red flag flapping in the breeze, because that's not the Jesus revealed so far in John. That's not what Jesus said he came to do. Okay. If we get to verse 11, so we got that established first, and then verse 11. And this is kind of confusing, because what does Jesus do in verse 11?
Lays down his life for his sheep.
I'm the shepherd.
Now I'm the shepherd. I'm going to take this same story and I'm going to turn it around. And now I don't want you to see me as the gate anymore, because he's not going to reference the gate one more time. Now I want you to see me as
The good shepherd.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that.
But
Because he said it's not. He doesn't say, I am
the shepherd.
the shepherd. He says, I am
The good shepherd.
the good shepherd. And the fact that he uses the word good,
Means there are bad shepherds.
that there are other shepherds
That aren't
that
truth.
may not be
Good.
They're
good,
not truth.
that may not be good. Now that becomes, to me, I saw getting when I was reading that this morning, and I thought, whoa, that's pretty powerful. Because now he talked about strangers who the sheep don't recognize, and thieves and robbers that are coming to kill. I mean, they're pretty obvious. That's like the Satan that walks around with horns and hooves and a pointy tail. I mean, you can spot that. So that's Satan's not hard to identify. Yeah, I mean, it may be hard to avoid, but he's not hard to identify. We can see him coming at us. We could cross the street. But now he's talking about shepherds, which means all shepherds come, because he's already said all shepherds come in through the gate.
Wolves in sheep's clothing.
But he is the good shepherd, which is really, really fascinating.
What's the word in Greek?
Oh,
I'm just curious as to.
What, for good?
For good, yeah.
Callum. Callum is the word for good. Callum. Yeah.
And what besides good does it mean?
I'd have to look. Offhand, I don't know.
Well, because we use just this one adjective for
Yeah.
it. I'm sure there are.
Other applications of it. I'll find that. In fact, I meant to bring my Greek, because there's something I was going to show y'all. Something really interesting happening in the Greek in this. But I'd have to check on it if it has alternative.
Okay.
Alternative
I was just
meanings.
curious.
But that's an excellent question, because he is using an adjective here, which
And
about.
when we apply an English word to a Greek word, we don't always get the full meaning.
Right.
So I was just
Right.
curious.
And especially in John, because John loves to have word plays, words with multiple meanings. That's good. I'll check it. Now it's interesting when he says good, he's contrasting himself with
The other ones.
the other shepherds. He's not contrasting himself with
The
thieves and strangers and thieves and robbers, because they aren't shepherds. So now he is among the shepherds. He is
The good shepherd.
the good shepherd. So he may do things that make him distinct from these other guys. And so these other guys may not be thieves and robbers, and they may not be strangers,
But they are definitely.
But they are not good. They are not
Good.
a definitive article.
Yeah.
They are not the good shepherd. Because the good shepherd does something
Lays down his
that
life.
they don't. And what does a good shepherd do?
Lays down his
life for his sheep. Now we, the reader, as soon as he says that, we say, oh, well, we know what he's talking about. What's he talking about?
His crucifixion.
Okay, talking about crucifixion and John, the crucifixion and resurrection, kind of the same event, as Jesus heading back home, and we know that. So when he says that, our ears kind of perk up. Yeah, he's talking about, I didn't even need to ask that. Everybody in this room knew he was talking about that. And you may not have read this passage for years, but you knew what that meant, because that's what he's going to do. Now, here, if he's not contrasting himself with thieves and robbers who want to kill, and he's not contrasting himself with strangers whose voice the sheep don't recognize, who does he contrast himself
Wolf.
with?
Hired.
Hired hands.
Oh, okay.
Hired hands. Now, they're not thieves and they're not strangers, right?
But
You
they're
know.
not as committed either.
But they are not the good shepherd.
But they're not as committed either.
That's exactly right. And what is the fundamental difference
They run
between,
away.
well, you're right. Why do they run away? What is the fundamental difference between the good shepherd and the hired hand?
The good shepherd, they are his sheep and he takes care of the sheep.
Yes, the good shepherd owns the sheep. The sheep belong to him. The
When you
hi-
take ownership of something, then you're committed to taking care of it.
Exactly. And the hired hands, even though they may be shepherds,
They may be
shepherds in
okay
that,
shepherds.
yeah, in that they came in through the gate, right? They came in through the gate. The sheep recognize their voice. They lead them out to green pastures and all this kind of jazz. That's what the hired hands, man, if the hired hands weren't doing that, they would not be hired anymore, right? You know, it's like working at the machining shop. If you got a guy that says, I'm not going to work that machine, or any machine, that guy is, is now going to be unemployed, right? He's going to be working at Kmart. You know, it's, you can't do, so hired hands do that, do the shepherding job, but they are not
The owner.
the owner. And who is the owner? The good shepherd is the one who
And he
owns.
loves his sheep.
Okay, so because they don't own the sheep, when something happens,
They run away.
Oh, well, not my loss.
they run away because they don't really care for the sheep. Now, why don't they care for the sheep?
Because they aren't theirs.
Duh, it's not theirs. They're not going to lay down their life for somebody else's sheep. You know, they don't do
He'll get his
it.
other job somewhere, right?
Well, you know, it may look bad on my resume,
But-
you know, that I didn't fight. But I'll tell you something, I am not going to fight a wolf for Van's sheep. You know, no offense, Van. You know, if you got a flock of sheep, I ain't fighting a wolf to protect that flock of sheep. You don't pay me enough.
I'll be there.
Yeah. You'll be, that's right, because it's your flock. Okay, so the good, and then he repeats it, right? In verse 14, he says, I am, again,
The good
shepherd.
the good shepherd. And I've read this, I can't tell you how many times I've read this. And I've never been struck by that adjective. The importance of, not just him being good, because he's of course good, but the fact that adjective separates him from other shepherds. That never struck me, but I think that's exactly what's going on here. Because the contrast is not with thieves, it's
Isn't it interesting
with
that he
hiding.
uses the term good shepherd, but whenever the man asked him, said good teacher, why do you call me good?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, because where do you find that passage or that verse where he says, the person says, good teacher, and he says, why do you call me good? Only God is good. Where do you find that? Matthew, Mark, Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's in the story of the rich young ruler, the rich ruler. You know, that's where he said. But you don't find it where?
In John.
You don't find it in John. You know, because I thought of that too. You know, but that's, it's not in, that's.
I'm just saying I find it interesting that the same words that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wouldn't apply to Jesus, even to Jesus.
Right.
John would.
John would. Yes. And that tells you a lot about the difference between John and the other. And even Jesus, as they present Jesus, his perception of himself, that Jesus will not accept the title of even being good in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in John, he says, I am the good shepherd. That's me. I am good. So he claims that for himself. Yeah, that's that contrast that we see in the Gospels. One group is over here, the other's here. Both of them are telling a truth about Jesus that we need to claim, but it's kind of coming from a different angle. Okay, so he as the good shepherd owns the flock, right? Belongs to him. And what will he do that the hired hand won't?
Care about his sheep.
He's going to care about them, and therefore he's going to do what? What is he willing to do?
Lay down his life.
He's willing to lay down his life. Now, and I don't know, maybe I'm hesitating getting into it. Just imagine the implications, though, of him saying, these are my sheep. I own the flock. Because the last time I looked, and I lived in sheep country when I was in the Yellowstone River Valley. Lord have mercy, there were sheep everywhere. Dumbest animals God created. There's no animal dumber than a sheep. They'll go right over a cliff.
Yep.
They'll go right over a cliff. If the leader leads, they're gone. You're dumb. Sheep are just dumb. And dirty. And really dirty.
That's right.
But I don't know any sheep that says, oh, I want to be in this flock.
No. They go where
They go wherever somebody's leading them. And they, like I said, they're just dumb. And so you think, just file away the implications. If we're intended to be the sheep and we are owned by Jesus, we are part of Jesus's flock.
regardless.
Yeah, not because of what we decided. We're part of his flock because that's what God decided. We are owned because of God.
It's interesting that he would leave the 99 and go for the 100.
Yeah.
The one that
The
was
one that's
lost. Because each one has so much value to
Right,
him.
right.
See, for a long time, I never quite understood that. That he would go for that one that was lost. And until I read that story, but I don't know names. I forget whatever book it was in where his son left, and then he.
Oh yeah, but they Luke, because that's part of 3.
Yeah.
It's the lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, and you got those 3 in Luke, and yeah, all of them have the same lesson. The woman with the coin, the shepherd with the sheep, and the woman with the coin, and the father with the son. All of them love, the one that's found.
Yeah.
And it's that
Not
love
any
that's.
more than the one that was still there.
No,
Right,
because
but just
that-
loves it. Now, and that's why you can't even look at practicality, because for a shepherd to leave the 99 alone, unguarded in a field is
Not common sense.
stupid. It's
Not
stupid.
common sense.
Yeah, not common sense, because a wolf's going to take 2 or 3 of them. But it doesn't have to do with this is not a how-to shepherd. This shows
The concern.
the concern and
individual.
that he would even do that for the sake of one. That shows it's just like the woman spending all day looking for a coin.
I got thousands of things to do.
Maybe,
Like that.
but or the father doing this, which the elder son kind of feels dissed, because he was right, he never had a party. Dad never threw me a party, but now this guy comes back and you throw him a big party. That ain't fair, and you know what?
He's right.
It ain't. And that's the kind of thing older children have to face all the time. And babies get the party. Babies get the
Baby
party.
is sitting here going, that's what we were talking about a little bit.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
God never said
I'm a
life
baby,
would be
my
fair.
Yeah.
Equitable.
He is a best
God never said life would be fair.
spoiled baby.
Yeah, that's right.
Just ask Donna.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'm now mad. And if somebody has something about a brother, I don't want to deal with it. All right, so we've got this shepherd. And what does like verse 18 suggest about, and this kind of breaks that shepherd deal down a little bit. Verse 18, why he does
I like
this.
verse 16 though. Can you go back
Okay.
to that one?
Good. I skipped that and I shouldn't have. Because we've got, yes, I have, because that's really important. So we've got him willing to do that. Now what does he say in verse 16?
He has other sheep that aren't about him.
He's got other sheep that aren't in this fold. And he's going to bring them too. And they're going to listen to his voice.
And they're all going to be one.
What's that? That's right. And eventually they're going to bring it into one. Now, why is it so important for Jesus to mention this?
Because right now he's talking to the Jews, but then the Gentiles are going to be part of the flock.
we got, you see yourself, and he's going to kind of come back to Jews later in this chapter. Exactly right. For us, though, we're not thinking now, oh yeah, the Jews on there, it's the Gentiles. Maybe we want to.
You guys and me. We can be one.
There's an old joke, and I'm gonna use it, and I'm gonna use Baptists because there aren't a huge number of Baptists around here. Down south, there's a lot.
There's a lot of Baptists.
There's a lot of Baptists. So I'll use Baptists so I won't offend. As not to offend. It's not really that offensive, but. Guy dies, goes to heaven, and Peter says, "I'm going to show you around," and he starts showing, and he says, "That's where the Presbyterians live, and that's where the Lutherans live, that's where the Methodists live," and then they walk by this great big wall, and he says, "Shh." They walk by the wall, and then he comes to the other side, and he says, "Oh, that's where the Catholics live, and that's where," and the guy taps him on the shoulder and says, "Wait, whoa, hold. I understand all that, but why did we have to be quiet when we walked by the wall?" And he said, oh, that's where the Baptists live, and they think they're the only ones here. That's kind of what he's saying here. That, and the wall analogy is pretty good. That this is the only pen, and I think he is talking about Jews related because that's the context. That there are people who are outside of this pen that are also, and remember, we're talking about people who belong to his flock, not by their choice, but by
His choice.
his choice, by his choice, and they're going to what?
Follow.
Follow. They're going to hear his voice and they're going to follow. And there's going to be one flock. Okay, so thank you, Don, because I just skipped that, and that's really important because it really broadens it out, and I think that's crucial enough that he includes it. And then he gives us in verse 18 a little insight into what's, because and even in verse 17, which is a gar clause, he tells us the definitive sign that he's the good shepherd. That he lays down his life, that he might take it up again. And then in verse 18,
Lay it down again.
he explains what that means. And the analogy with the shepherd kind of breaks down because shepherds don't die and come back. So that makes him really
That makes him the good shepherd.
That makes him the good shepherd. And so right now we got this story, right? That he gave, just a basic story. And from that story he comes to two. He wants us to see these two things. What does he want us to see?
He wanted us to see that you have to go through him to be part of the flock.
Because he is
The gate.
the gate. And he wants us to
the
see.
shepherd the good shepherd, the one that will lay down his life for us.
Okay, that becomes that definitive sign.
And that's what he
For
does.
us. Exactly, that's what he does, and we know it. Now, he says this, resonates with the church. Remember that he's right, this is being written to Christians. This isn't being left in a hotel room for non-pagans to look at and convert. This is being written to Christians so that they can understand what it means to be
A Christian.
loved, but what it means to be a Christian, a loved Christian. So it's for Christians to understand their faith, not to cause someone who has no background to all of a sudden say, whoa, that's not the intention. It may do that, but that's not the intention, sort of to teach us. And as he says this is what he's done. What's the reaction? And by the way, who is reacting?
The Jews.
The Jews. And we see the Jews, we always like to see the Jews, right? And the Jews are now divided, right? And the division, now we've already seen that even when it says Jews believe, at the end they don't believe. They don't believe. They don't, because too much of stuff, we saw that in the last chapter. All the stuff with Moses gets in the way of them accepting Jesus for who he is. So even when they're really close to believing, they gotta pull back because other stuff gets in the way, become distractions. And they become divided. And some say
he's demon possessed, but you can see that. I mean, the man doesn't know if he's a gate. He doesn't know if he's the good shepherd. I mean, he's going to lay down his life and pick it back up. I mean, he is raving mad.
yeah, he's kind of a nut. Yeah. At the very least, he's confusing. Really confusing, yeah. Other people say
He healed a blind.
he healed a blind man, which ties it back to the story that came before. But that's kind of the only connection. And why, based on what he's been saying about sheepfolds and sheeps and shepherds and all this jazz, why does this division become kind of significant? What does it show about the Jews?
I think some of them really want to believe, but they're afraid to believe.
Well, are they believing yet?
No.
No, they don't believe. The Jews just aren't right now
Ready.
ready. Yeah, and we'll see even later. It gets even more dramatic than that. So we've got the Jews, they're divided. They're not believing, So what happens in verse 22? So we've got this story. I think it continues when we go. What do we got in verse 22?
The dedication of Jerusalem.
We got the
Yes.
dedication, and you know what that is? Hanukkah. That's Hanukkah. So this is Hanukkah, and where is Jesus?
At the temple.
Lord have mercy. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he didn't go to Jerusalem. Luke, he went as a little boy and as an infant, and then never. The rest of it, in Mark and Matthew, he isn't in Jerusalem at all until the crucifixion. In John,
He's there.
he's in Jerusalem all the time.
The interesting thing is the Jews were commanded to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year to observe all the feasts. And if Jesus was any kind of a Jew, he was there. He just didn't tell us about it.
He was there. It certainly Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't want us to see Jesus in Jerusalem all the time, and I think there's a reason. Certainly in Luke, because everything flows to Jerusalem and flows out. But Jerusalem becomes kind of this pivotal. This journey to Jerusalem becomes a big deal, and they don't want to have Jesus in Jerusalem.
During that.
Yeah, 3 times a year. Good night. He goes to 3 Passovers, for crying out loud. That's 3-year ministry. The other ones don't seem that long, but this is a long time. Okay, the journey to Jerusalem in John doesn't seem significant because he's in Jerusalem all the time. So he's in Jerusalem. He's at the temple. Who comes and what do they want?
The Jews come around.
Okay, the Jews.
And they, are you going to finally tell us if you're the Christ?
Now, why is that ironic that they'd ask, okay, we've been waiting, when are you going to tell us whether you're the Messiah?
He's been telling them.
He's been telling them all the time. And how has he been telling them?
Through
By
things.
what he's been
Well, by what he's been doing, by what he's been saying. I mean, how, it's almost you look at it and say,
They didn't listen.
yeah, how can you be, very good, Van. They're not listening. Ooh. And he just talked about sheep hearing. Boy, I got to think about that a little bit. Wow. All right. And Jesus says to him what?
I did tell you.
Man, I did tell you and you don't believe, right? And what demonstrates his identity?
The miracles.
Well, what does he say? What should identify him?
His voice.
His voice should, what does he say? How does he, because in verse 25, Jesus answered, I told you, and you do not believe. What should cause them to believe?
The miracles he does.
The works, the miracles that he does
In his
Father's name testify, bear witness to me, but you don't believe. And now we come down to it. You don't believe because you do not
Aren't my
belong
sheep.
to my sheep. You are not one of my sheep. Whoa! And why are they not one of his sheep?
They don't listen.
They don't believe.
They don't
don't believe it.
listen.
Wow. Why? Wow. What is he saying about then the Jews?
They're his people.
They're religious, but they're
But
not.
they don't
believers.
believe.
Well, okay, right. Isn't he saying even something stronger than that? I agree with you. He's certainly saying that. He says, he doesn't just say you don't believe. He says what? You do not belong to my sheep. You do not belong. In other words,
You don't got it right.
You are not one of my sheep. You are not part of my flock. Yeah. Because my sheep know my voice and you don't.
Yeah.
And you are not part of my flock. Wow. They then, these Jews, who are what? God's chosen people, are not part of the flock. That's what he's saying here, right?
Yes.
Now, remember we talked about the context. The church that's hearing this. What did we say has happened? Evidently has happened in that church. Because
There's a division
There-
because of persecution from
right,
Jews.
and you do not have in this church people who identify themselves as Jews in the church anymore. The Jews are out. The Jews may have, because he talked, remember last week, the mother said they're throwing people out of the synagogue. You know, so you can't be a Jew and a Christian. Not in John's community, because he's already said they're throwing people out of the synagogue. So there's this radical break that we don't see in the other Gospels. You know, you don't have that radical break. And that's why it's not the Jews being the enemy, it's scribes and Pharisees are the enemy. You know, but here the Jews are. They've had a big break. How is John's church reading this?
That they're in the right place.
That John's church isn't right and the Jews are,
Wrong.
whoa, even to the point where, and remember, it's, you know, your relationship with God is ultimately based on you being part of God's flock, you know, not based on you. Lord have mercy. The Jews are not part of God's flock anymore. Wow. Now, what are the theological implications? If I say the Jews aren't part of God's flock,
Who is?
okay, who is? Now, who is?
Christian.
Christians, people who believe in Jesus, are demonstrated because they hear his voice and respond. What is that saying about all the promises God gave in the Old Testament to the Jews?
They have to come together in order to,
Can they come together?
well, if they want to be part of God's,
Do sheep choose to be part of God's flock? Do the
Have to
sheep
be
make that
chosen
decision?
by God.
Wow. Makes sense in John's context. Because the split has occurred and he is building out this community that's split off from the Jews. Now, this becomes a real theological problem. Because if what is said here is we're going to take it to its natural conclusion, the Jews aren't part of God's people anymore. They're not part of God's flock anymore. And if you're not part of God's flock, the flock can't say, oh, I've changed my mind, I want to be part again. Because they're sheep, and sheep don't make that decision. You got a theological problem. Because that means the promises of God are what? Changeable. And if the promises of God are changeable, that God can change his promises,
What do we base anything on?
why wouldn't God tomorrow say, you know, this business with Jesus just hasn't worked the way I wanted. I'm going to send down somebody else. You know, if God's promises aren't reliable, one, God is not eternal anymore. You know, God is
And God
based on a
lies.
timeline. And God lies. God is not perfect in his truthfulness because he's changeable. He's not immutable because he changes his mind. So it's not a constancy. Therefore, we got no basis. You know, we got no basis of hope because God could damn us tomorrow. He becomes Zeus. God becomes Zeus. Right? Could change his mind anytime he wants. This is a major theological problem. And John doesn't deal with it because the context is so clear. You've got this separation, and he doesn't want his church that's being persecuted by the Jews to look at the Jews and say, oh, well, they're not bad. Or they're still God's people. They're okay. Because that creates all kinds of problems. But Paul recognizes it. Because if you look at Romans, the most important part of Romans is, I think, is 9, 10, and 11. Because that's where, and then 12, he shifts gears into ethics. And 9, 10, and 11, if you read it, is all about how God is dealing with the Jews. And what Paul will say is, because the problem is the Jews have rejected Jesus and are persecuting Christians, how can they be God's people? Well, if they're not God's people, then God has changed his mind, sent a different covenant, which is that's what some people say. There were two different covenants. God has changed his mind. The old covenant is no longer valid. We're into something new, which means God doesn't keep his word. And Paul deals with that. If you want to hear what Paul said, read those 3 chapters. Because that becomes what Paul that's his point to the Romans. This is how God is dealing with the Jews. So you Gentiles, don't worry. Don't worry. But here, he doesn't say it. So the Jews are outside, right? And what does he, so he's not part of the Jews. What does he say he's going to give to his sheep? Verse 28.
Eternal life.
He's going to give them eternal life. And we know what that is, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, if he's giving eternal life to these people that are part of his flock, that means eternal life right now is not available to the Jews. Now, Paul is going to modify that. Paul's going to change that. But in John, that's kind of where we are. And I guess my point is, we don't need to soften this. This is why we take the whole Bible. Everything we believe isn't found in one verse. That's why we got to read Romans to understand how God is dealing with the Jews.
John was writing this to show the church he was writing to that they didn't have to be a Jew to be able to be God's sheep.
Right.
So it's not saying that the Jews can't be God's sheep, just that they aren't if they're persecuted.
Well, maybe. I think it's even stronger than that. That could be. I think it's even stronger. I think he's saying here, and again, that's why you can't say, well, he says it here, that one verse, we can't cherry pick verses. Because if we cherry pick verses, man, we can find a verse that justifies anything.
Oh, yeah.
We could I had a guy come into me when I was in Indianapolis. He was scary. He was really scary. Danny Young. I ended up testifying in a trial against him because he was going through his girlfriend's garbage. He had issues. He came into my office once, but he would come to studies. And he said one time that he'd come to a new conclusion. He'd been studying the Bible and came to a conclusion that incest is okay.
Oh my goodness.
Well, it's done in the Bible.
Well-
You've got all these places where it happened.
I know, but it isn't.
Yeah. Well, he says that's obvious because Seth had children, and if Adam and Eve were the only ones,
Absolutely.
had to marry his sister. That's the only way he had kids. And he says incest is okay, and so is
And
polygamy.
you got Lot, his daughter.
And he married a woman in my church who had children, and I didn't marry him. They got married somewhere. They left and got married somewhere else. But that really concerned me because when he said that incest was, you don't need a lot of creativity to get the Bible to say anything you want if you cherry pick, and that's why you can't cherry pick. You got to look at the whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
But in here, because he wants his Christians to know, look, these guys are dumping on you. We don't need to give them benefit of the doubt because they're after you. So let's look at them as a lost cause and let's focus here. Okay? So, and he says in verse 30, that about he and the Father, and this really gets the Jews mad. He and the Father are one, and how do the Jews react?
They want to stone.
They want to stone him because they assume he's doing what? Blasphemy, claiming to be God, and he says what to them?
I've shown you miracles from the Father.
Man,
Yeah,
I've been showing you works from the Father the whole time, right? And you're going to stone me for doing what I've done? And how do the Jews respond?
They're not stoning him for any of these.
That's right. We're not stoning you for what you do. We're stoning you because
Blasphemy.
you have committed blasphemy because you're doing what?
Claiming to be God.
You are making yourself God. And then Jesus quotes something from the 82nd Psalm and says,
said you are gods.
if you look at your Bible, it says, I say you are gods. How does that undercut their argument? And this is an odd little verse. way to what is he saying to the people who are saying, we're going to stone you not because of what you did, because of what you claim. And you're claiming to be God. And what does he say? The Old Testament says, we are all gods. We are all gods. And it does, if you look at the 82nd Psalm. But it certainly is really little g God, and you got to kind of understand the view of God is a little different. So it undercuts their argument, kind of. And if you get excited about it, that's wonderful. Because it's, it's sort of a technique to undercut.
My explanation
good.
says that they called them gods, but they were the judges, the leaders, the interpreting the law. So they weren't actually capital G God. They
right.
Were all, it's just a term.
Yeah, because he even qualifies it in the 82nd Psalm because it says God's the children of the Most High. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, it's showing an importance, not divinity. Right. He's not looking at it in terms of divinity. He's looking at it in terms of this. Okay, so what does he challenge him to do now? In verse 37.
I'm seeing it.
You don't believe me unless I do the works of my Father.
Okay.
37.
All right. And so what's the point? What point is he trying to make?
If I'm doing what God says, why don't you believe me?
Yeah, why don't you believe me? And of course we know why they don't believe him. Why don't they believe him?
Because they think he's
Can't
blaspheming.
hear.
Because they can't hear. That's right, they can't hear. Why can't they hear?
Because they're not one of his
Because they're not sheep, one of his sheep, and they don't recognize his voice. Gosh, it goes back to that original story. And how do the Jews respond to that little tidbit?
They seize him
They
and he
still try to see
escaped.
him.
Right. Now, they can believe in the works, but even if they believe in the works he does, they're not
Believing me, he's God.
they're not believing in him.
Right.
They're not believing in him. And if they don't believe in him, they won't
Through the gate.
they won't go through the gate.
Mm-hmm.
They won't
Well,
go through the gate.
they didn't stone him here because he got away, but, it said before that they couldn't touch him because it wasn't time.
That's exactly right. And it's happened again, right? Because they try to arrest him, and what?
He
got
gets away.
He escapes from their hand, and what does Jesus do?
Goes back.
He goes back, but it's kind of interesting. He goes back,
To where he's baptized.
okay,
John was-
where John was baptizing earlier. And what happens?
Many
John
people
never
came.
performed miracles.
Okay, many people
Came to
come and
They believe.
believe, which means these people are,
Sheep.
they're
Are
sheep. Yes, it going into the sheepfold, right?
Yeah.
Because they're following the good shepherd. And what becomes really kind of ironic is he goes to the place where John was baptizing, right? Which is outside of Judea. So he goes again like he did in Samaria, and they believe. Now he's going outside of Judea, and people are coming to him and
Believing.
believing, but the Jews,
Not so much.
not so much. Even when they believe, they start to trip and move away from believing because they follow who?
Tradition.
They follow Moses and don't follow him. Okay. Entering, Jesus is the gate by which we enter. Jesus is the shepherd who leads us. And when we hear his voice, that shows
Where is she?
that we're in the flock.
And I like how it says on the bottom that, John never performed miracle signs, that all John said about the man was true.
Yep.
And in that case, many believed in Jesus.
Yep, and remember John as presented in the Gospel of John. John the Baptist as presented in John. Who was John the Baptist?
First disciple.
He was the first disciple. He was the first one.
First sheep.
He's the first sheep. Yeah. He was maybe the first shepherd. Maybe the first shepherd.
No, a shepherd.
Yeah, not capital S, but a shepherd.
Small.
That he was the first one. That was the first one. So, and also, think about the fact that John was mentioned where in the gospel? Where did John mention the Baptist in his gospel?
The first chapter.
Right at the beginning, right? Third chapter is the last time he's mentioned, and then he disappears. In the other gospels, he shows up, the thing with Herod and stuff. But at the beginning of the gospel, John's mentioned, and now he's mentioned again, which may tell us that we're coming to where in the story.
Coming to
We
the
may
world.
Where he gets arrested.
Yeah, we may be getting closer
Close.
to the end. So he brings up this figure from the beginning that we may be getting closer to the end. And we are, because in chapter 13 is when bad things start happening in John.
Yeah.
Okay, next week we're going to look at chapter 11. And chapter 11 is one that's unified by one event. And what is the one event in chapter 11?
Resurrection of
The
Lazarus.
raising of Lazarus. And the whole chapter is, we're going to have another I am statement in there too. Okay, let's have a word of, again, thank you so much for your patience. This was a lot of stuff in this chapter. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you for guiding us through this. Remind us that you are the gate. Therefore, we enter by trusting in you and by listening to what you've said, fully aware that there are people who wish to destroy us, to hurt us, that have climbed over the fence. We got to focus our attention on the gate, because it's through the gate that the shepherds enter. And we also need to focus our attention on you as the good shepherd, because you know our voice, you know us by name, and we know your voice, and that you're going to lead us out into the world to do your work. So help us to be aware of who you are. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Again, thank
Isn't it
you.
interesting that Jesus is showing us so many facets of what he is?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the way, the truth, the life, the gate, the shepherd, the bread, all these things.
The resurrection and the life he'll do later.
Without having a full picture of him, we limit him.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's all from John. All those images are from John. The vine, where the branches draw strength. That I'm the vine, that I'm the resurrection and the life. All these powerful images of who Jesus is. And when you combine that with all these other images we pick up from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, about the one who was born in Bethlehem, the son of the virgin, the one, who suffered and died and felt human pain, the one who birthed the church, was the one that promised that the Spirit would come on the disciples gathered in Jerusalem. When you combine all these things, we get a portrait of Jesus is almost broader than we can kind of grasp.
Well, isn't that what we're supposed to get?
Right.
Because there's nothing he can't handle.
For sure, absolutely. And that's not even mentioning all the stuff Paul writes. And Paul was writing his stuff before the Gospels were even written. There were no Gospels when Paul was writing. So Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy. And that's why, studying Scripture, man, I looked at this new today, and I was, whoa, I think stuff is going on here I didn't see before.
You do go back and read over something, and you can always get something that you didn't get.
Yeah. And that's a good thing. And it's okay. That's okay. We don't.
It helps you understand it a little better.
Well, I think so. I hope so. That we get a new insight or a new application. Or maybe something in the world changes or in our lives have changed. That all of a sudden, something hits us in a way because we're dealing with something we didn't deal with in the past. All of a sudden it hits us in a new way.
Are those papers all your writing?
What's that?
Are those papers there all your writing?
Yes. Did I write this?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a good thing. It's very small. I would have a hard time.
Well, that's why I have it close. But this is how I did, and this is how I taught history, and this is how I taught school. Same thing.
Yeah.
Just pages of questions. I'll leave.
Well, if you make it interesting, people are going to listen, and kids in particular. If you make it interesting to them, they want to learn. They want to hear.
Well, yeah.
You know.
So. And I think too, and this is, it's just an amendment. I think if you can help people find the answer, rather than tell them the answer.
I think
Yeah.
if you have to find the answer, it becomes part of you.
Yeah.
If you are told everything, then you're just programmed. And when push comes to shove, do you believe?
Right. One of the things, whether I'm successful in doing it, I don't know. And I'm not the judge of whether I'm successful. And sometimes I am and sometimes I'm not, I guess. Is I want to give the people, and I wanted when I was teaching history at school and economics in school, I want to give my kids the confidence to look at the material, believing that they can understand it. Because I'm going to ask questions that they're going to be able to answer. And every time they give me an answer, they feel a little more confident. They feel, and even if the answer is pretty clear, if here, what did Jesus say? Well, it says here because that's what it says. The confidence level is upped a little bit, and I want people
Most
to.
teachers, after they've taught the lesson, or even if you went to a seminar, any questions.
Right.
And probably you feel better if somebody does ask the question, and everybody just stands there like,
Well, yeah. Well, I'll tell you. And since I ask questions during it. It's when I ask a question and nobody says it, everybody's looking
I
at
was
me.
gonna say, oh, please.
and Highlands.
I've been in meetings with you.
Well, it's funny. I was listening to the radio when a guy was talking about, he was at a seminar about fire safety in the building. And he says, the guy was talking about stuff we already knew. Talk about fire safety. And we already knew it because we'd already had these before. And the presentation went on a half an hour. A whole half an hour. We were in that room listening. And at the end, the person says, are there any questions? And he said, darn it, a guy raised his hand and said, well, if you're living in my apartment, I've got a balcony. If there's a fire in my building, should I go on the balcony to wait for help? And the guy said, I wanted to tell him, put that hand down. We're in a building that doesn't have balconies. You're talking about your apartment. And he says the guy who did the presentation spent 15 minutes talking about going on balconies. And we all had to sit there and listen to something that didn't have anything to do with the presentation.
And lunch is sitting over there getting cold.
Because somebody, you know what?
Somebody had to ask some
Peg,
stupid question.
I'm guessing. I bet it was the youngest child.
Yeah. Always the
Would
youngest.
ask. I bet the youngest would raise their hand.
Center of
Yeah, and oh yeah. I bet it would be the youngest. Now that I think, because the oldest
And
would
the oldest
never.
would
The
go,
oldest would never.
please,
Would
just
know.
yes.
Yeah, we just want to go because we already know. Or we think we know. Go home.
Anything for a